Dawn broke cold over the ridgeline on March 14, 1951, and Corporal Edwin Hayes hadn't slept in 31 hours. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline still coursing through his veins after the firefight that had shattered the platoon's position 6 hours earlier. 23 men had been dug in along that ridge. Now he was alone. The radio was destroyed. The lieutenant was dead somewhere in the ravine below, and the North Korean forces that had overrun their position were regrouping less than 300 yards downslope. Hayes crouched behind a shattered pine tree, his M1 Garand clutched tight, and listened to voices speaking a language he didn't understand drifting up through the morning mist. He had two options: run or make a stand with a weapon everyone said couldn't do what he needed it to do. But Hayes had spent 6 months modifying that rifle in secret, against regulations, using techniques no manual would ever teach. What happened in the next 11 hours would prove that sometimes the most desperate innovations come not from engineers and laboratories, but from soldiers who refuse to accept the word impossible. If you believe stories like this shouldn't vanish with time, subscribe. Let's keep their memory alive together. Edwin Hayes grew up in the hill country of eastern Kentucky, where survival meant understanding machinery, improvisation, and hard mathematics of making limited resources stretch beyond their intended capacity. His father ran a small gunsmithing shop in a town barely large enough to appear on most maps, and from the age of 7, Hayes spent his afternoons watching the old man disassemble rifles, pistols, and shotguns brought in by farmers and hunters who needed repairs but couldn't afford factory parts. The shop smelled of gun oil, metal shavings, and particular burnt copper scent that clings to firing pins and ejection ports. Hayes learned early that firearms were not sacred objects to be accepted as designed, but mechanical systems that could be understood, adjusted, and improved based on need. His father taught him that every weapon had tolerances, that every mechanism had play in it, and that a good gunsmith knew where those margins existed and how to exploit them without catastrophic failure. By the time Hayes was 14, he could field strip and reassemble a Springfield 1903 blindfolded, and by 16, he was modifying trigger groups to reduce pull weight and shimming barrels to improve accuracy for local competitive shooters. He understood metallurgy in an intuitive, hands-on way that had nothing to do with textbooks and everything to do with thousands of hours watching steel behave under stress. When the Korean War broke out in June 1950, Hayes was 22 years old, working in a Louisville machine shop and spending weekends at rifle competitions across the state. He wasn't particularly patriotic in the flag-waving sense, but he understood duty in the same practical way he understood machinery. When something needed doing, you did it, and you did it right. He enlisted in August, went through basic training at Fort Knox, and quickly discovered that the Army had very specific ideas about how soldiers should treat their weapons. The M1 Garand he was issued was a robust, reliable rifle, semi-automatic, firing the powerful .30-06 cartridge from an 8-round M-block clip. It was a weapon that had helped win World War II, and military doctrine treated it with an almost religious reverence. Soldiers were taught to maintain their Garands according to strict procedures. Clean them exactly as instructed, never modify them, never deviate from the approved manual, and trust that the weapon would perform as designed. Hayes understood the reasoning behind this standardization. The military needed weapons that functioned predictably across millions of units, but he also saw the limitations. The M1 was excellent at ranges up to 400 yards, but beyond that, accuracy dropped significantly. The iron sights were optimized for a rapid target acquisition at close to medium range, not precision shooting. And the rifle's balance, while good for general infantry work, wasn't ideal for the kind of sustained, long-distance defensive shooting that Hayes suspected would matter in the mountainous terrain of Korea. He arrived in Korea in November 1950, assigned to the 23rd Infantry Regiment, and spent his first 2 months in a brutal fighting retreat as Chinese forces poured across the Yalu River. The chaos of that winter taught him things no training manual covered, that firepower mattered less than precision when ammunition was limited, that holding a position often meant making every shot count, and that the soldiers who survived weren't necessarily the bravest, but the ones who adapted fastest to conditions nobody had planned for. During those frozen weeks, Hayes watched men die because their weapons couldn't reach enemy positions on distant ridgelines, because their shots went wild in the cold, because the M1 standard configuration simply wasn't optimized for the kind of warfare Korea demanded. He saw machine gunners overrun because they couldn't accurately engage targets beyond 300 yards. He saw riflemen burn through ammunition, trying to suppress enemy positions they could barely see, let alone hit, and he began to think about modifications. The idea started simply: improve the M1's accuracy at extended range without compromising its reliability or rate of fire. Hayes knew he couldn't change the fundamental ballistics. The .30-06 cartridge was what it was, but he could refine the weapon's mechanical precision. He started with the barrel bedding, the way the barrel sat in the stock. The standard M1 had the barrel free-floating at the muzzle, but making contact with the stock at several points along its length. This was fine for general use, but it meant the barrel's vibration pattern changed depending on temperature, humidity, and how the rifle was held. Hayes began carefully shimming the barrel contact points using thin brass shims he fabricated from spent cartridge cases, adjusting the pressure so the barrel vibrated consistently with each shot. He tested his adjustments during range time, firing groups, and noting point of impact, then making microscopic changes to the shim thickness and position. It was painstaking work, done mostly at night by flashlight in his tent and completely against regulations. If an officer discovered what he was doing, he'd face disciplinary action at minimum. Next came the trigger. The standard M1 trigger had a pull weight of around 5 to 6 pounds, which was fine for combat shooting, but too heavy for precision work. Hayes disassembled the trigger group and carefully stoned the engagement surfaces, reducing friction and creep. He adjusted the sear engagement to the minimum safe depth, giving himself a crisp break at just under 4 pounds. This was dangerous territory. Too little engagement, and the rifle could fire accidentally. But Hayes had done this modification dozens of times in his father's shop, and he knew exactly where the line was. He tested the trigger obsessively, dry firing hundreds of times, checking for any sign of inconsistency or unsafe behavior. He never found any. The trigger broke clean and predictable, like snapping a glass rod. The iron sights were the biggest challenge. The M1's rear aperture sight was robust and quick to use, but not precise enough for the shooting Hayes envisioned. He couldn't replace the sights. That would be too obvious, but he could modify them. Using a needle file and magnifying glass borrowed from a medic, Hayes carefully opened up the rear aperture very slightly and squared the edges, giving himself a cleaner sight picture. He then adjusted the sight's elevation mechanism, shimming the spring to give him finer click adjustments. The front sight post he left alone. It was already as good as it could be without replacement. What he did do was blacken all the metal around the sights using a carbon soot mixture, reducing glare and sharpening contrast. These were tiny changes, nearly invisible to casual inspection, but together they gave him a sight picture that was noticeably crisper, especially at ranges beyond 300 yards. The final modification was the most unconventional. Hayes adjusted the gas system. The M1 Garand was gas-operated, using pressure from the fire cartridge to cycle the action. The gas port was designed to provide reliable cycling across a wide range of ammunition and conditions, which meant it was slightly overgassed by default. It used more gas pressure than strictly necessary, ensuring function even with weak ammunition or in dirty conditions. Hayes knew that reducing the gas flow slightly would reduce the violence of the action cycling, which would reduce barrel vibration and improve accuracy. But it was a razor's edge. Too little gas, and the rifle wouldn't cycle reliably, potentially jamming in combat, which would be fatal. He fabricated a tiny adjustable gas port restrictor from a piece of brass, small enough to hide inside the gas cylinder, and calibrated it over dozens of test fires until he found the sweet spot, just enough gas reduction to smooth the action without compromising reliability. He tested it with different ammunition lots in different temperatures. After deliberately fouling the rifle, it worked every time. By February 1951, Hayes had a weapon that, on paper, was still a standard M1 Garand, but in reality was capable of consistent accuracy to 600 yards in the hands of a skilled shooter. He'd tested it on makeshift ranges whenever possible, and the results were undeniable. He could hit man-sized targets at distances where most riflemen couldn't even see their targets clearly. But he kept quiet about it. Military culture didn't reward improvisation. It punished deviation from doctrine. Hayes was a corporal, not an officer, not an armorer, and certainly not someone whose opinions on weapon design mattered to anyone with rank. So he cleaned his rifle according to regulation, inspected it according to schedule, and never mentioned the hours of illegal modification work. He just waited for the situation where his work would matter. That situation came on March 13th, 1951, near a nameless ridgeline 17 miles south of the 38th parallel. Hayes' platoon, part of a larger company defensive position, was tasked with holding high ground overlooking a valley that served as a likely approach route for North Korean forces probing the American lines. Intelligence was thin. It always was. But the lieutenant figured they'd see some patrol activity, maybe a probing attack, nothing the dug-in platoon couldn't handle. They had interlocking fields of fire, a machine gun emplacement on the ridge's southern end, good visibility down into the valley, and radio contact with battalion headquarters 3 miles to the rear. It was a textbook defensive position, and morale was decent. The war had settled into a grinding stalemate, both sides maneuvering for position, and most of the men expected a quiet few days before rotation back to reserve positions. The attack came at 0230 hours, and it came from the wrong direction. North Korean forces had infiltrated through a ravine system that aerial reconnaissance had dismissed as impassable, approaching the American position from the north, where the terrain was steepest and the defenses lightest. The first indication of trouble was a sudden barrage of mortar fire that walked across the ridge with devastating accuracy, targeting the platoon's heavy weapons and radio position. Hayes, sleeping in a foxhole on the southern edge of the perimeter, woke to explosions and screaming. The mortars were followed immediately by a close assault force, probably a full company, moving fast through the darkness with supporting machine gun fire. The American position disintegrated within 20 minutes. The machine gun crew was overrun. The lieutenant was killed by mortar shrapnel while trying to call for support, and the radio was destroyed. Men fell back in small groups, tried to establish a new defensive line, but in the darkness and confusion, cohesion evaporated. Hayes found himself cut off from the main body of the platoon, along with 2 other men, pinned down by enemy fire in a secondary foxhole position. They held there for an hour, returning fire at muzzle flashes, burning through ammunition until a grenade landed between them. Hayes rolled away, the explosion shredding his left arm with shrapnel and killing both men beside him. He stumbled away from the position, bleeding, ears ringing, and slid down a steep slope into thick brush. Behind him, the firing was dying down as the North Korean forces secured the ridge. Hayes kept moving, instinct overriding shock, until he found a small ravine that offered concealment. He collapsed there, shaking, and tried to assess the situation. His left arm was torn up but functional, bleeding but not arterial. He had his rifle, still slung across his back, undamaged. He had 4 clips of ammunition, 32 rounds total. He had a canteen and knife, a first aid kit, and no idea where the rest of his platoon was, or if anyone else had survived. As the adrenaline faded, the pain set in, and Hayes used his teeth to tear open a sulfur packet and pour it into the worst of the shrapnel wounds, then wrapped the arm as best he could with gauze from the first aid kit. The morphine Soretti left alone, he'd need his head clear. As dawn approached, Hayes climbed carefully back up the slope to observe the ridge. What he saw settled a cold certainty into his gut. The North Korean forces had secured a position and were digging in, fortify what had been the American position. They weren't moving on, they were staying, which meant this ridgeline was strategically important, probably part of a larger offensive operation. Hayes counted at least 40 enemy soldiers, were more likely on the reverse slope. They had machine guns, mortars, and were establishing fighting positions facing south, toward the American lines. If they held this ridge, they have observation over the entire valley approach and could call artillery down on any American counterattack. And there was no way Hayes could reach friendly lines to report this. The valley between him and the American positions was open ground, easily a mile of terrain under enemy observation. Moving in daylight would be suicide, but staying was also a death sentence, just a slower one. The North Koreans would send patrols out, searching for survivors and securing the flanks of their new position. Hayes would be found within hours, probably, and he was in no condition for hand-to-hand combat or extended evasion. His arm was stiffening, and he could feel the dull throb of infection starting despite the sulfa. He had maybe 24 hours before fever and weakness made him combat ineffective. The smart play, the survival play, was to hide until nightfall and then try to slip away under darkness, abandon the ridge to the enemy, and hope to reach friendly lines before he collapsed. Hayes didn't make the smart play. He made the calculation that the modified rifle in his hands, the one he'd spent 6 months perfecting in secret, gave him an option nobody would expect. He could turn this ridgeline into a killing ground. He couldn't retake the position. One man couldn't do that. But he could make it so costly to hold that the enemy would abandon it, or at least be so disrupted that a friendly counterattack would have a chance. It was insane, tactically suicidal, and exactly the kind of mathematics his father had taught him. Assess your resources, identify the critical variable, and exploit margins nobody else sees. His margin was accuracy at range. Every other rifleman would need to be within 300 yards to engage effectively. Hayes could reach out to 500, maybe 600 yards, and the enemy wouldn't even know where the shots were coming from. He spent the next hour scouting positions. The ridgeline ran roughly east-west, with the enemy occupying the western end and the highest ground. Hayes was southeast of their position, lower in elevation, but with good concealment in thick scrub, oak, and pine. He found a spot about 420 yards from the enemy position, measured by pacing and terrain estimation, where he had a clear view of their digging activities but was completely hidden by vegetation and a slight fold in the ground. The sun would be behind him for most of the morning, making it even harder for the enemy to spot his muzzle flash. He piled loose rocks to create a stable rest for his rifle, arranged brush to break up his silhouette, and settled in to wait. His arm hurt badly, but he pushed the pain into a separate compartment of his mind, something to be dealt with later. Right now, he had work to do. The first shot came at 07:15, as the sun cleared the eastern hills and the enemy soldiers began moving more openly, confident they'd secured the position. Hayes selected his target carefully, an officer or senior NCO, judging by the way the man was directing other soldiers in their digging. The range was 430 yards, measured by mil dots Hayes had memorized in relation to his sight picture. Wind was maybe 3 miles per hour, left to right, negligible at this range with the .30-06's heavy bullet. Elevation was a critical factor. Hayes was shooting uphill, which meant the bullet would impact slightly higher than a flat trajectory shot. He dialed in what he estimated was a correct elevation hold, letting his breath settle, feeling the trigger's familiar glass rod break, and squeezed. The rifle barked, the action cycled smooth and fast, and 430 yards away, the North Korean officer collapsed like someone had cut his strings. The men around him scattered, diving for cover, shouting, scanning the terrain. But they were looking in the wrong places, searching the close ground, the obvious approaches. Nobody expected precision rifle fire from 400-plus yards. Hayes didn't move. He stayed frozen behind his concealment, watching, waiting for confusion to settle. It took almost 10 minutes before the enemy soldiers began to cautiously emerge again, trying to understand what had happened. Some thought it was a sniper closer in. Others thought maybe it was a stray shot from somewhere else entirely. Hayes waited until they began to relax, until their body language shifted from combat alertness to nervous confusion. Then he shot again. Another soldier down, this one at 410 yards. Hit center mass. More shouting, more diving for cover, but now with an edge of panic. 2 men dead, no idea where the shots were coming from, and the realization setting in that nowhere on that ridge was safe. For the next 3 hours, Hayes fought a war measured not in assaults and maneuvers, but in single, precisely placed shots separated by long intervals of stillness. He would fire, drop behind his concealment, wait for the enemy response, watch their patterns, then select the next target. He prioritized anyone who looked like leadership, anyone carrying a radio, anyone operating crew-served weapons. Each shot was a calculation: range, wind, elevation, the target's movement pattern, the likelihood of hitting versus the risk of revealing his position. His modified rifle performed exactly as he built it to perform. Every shot went where he aimed it. The trigger broke without disturbing his sight picture. The action cycled without throwing his position off target. He was shooting at ranges where the standard M1 would be hitting maybe 1 in 5 shots, and Hayes was hitting 4 out of 5. The 2 misses were both on moving targets at extreme range, shots he'd taken because the target was worth the risk. By 1000 hours, Hayes had fired 18 rounds and scored 16 hits. The North Korean position was in chaos. They knew they were under fire from somewhere to the southeast, but their return fire was wildly inaccurate, spraying bullets into empty hillsides hundreds of yards from Hayes' actual position. They tried sending out patrols to locate him, but Hayes shot the point man on the first patrol at 370 yards, and the patrol broke and ran back. They tried suppressing the entire southeastern slope with machine gun fire, but they were guessing at the range and wasting ammunition on terrain Hayes wasn't even near. Every time they thought they'd figured out his position and began to relax, Hayes would fire again from a slightly different angle. He'd identified 3 separate shooting positions within a 100-yard radius, and he rotated between them, and another man would go down. The psychological effect was devastating. The enemy soldiers couldn't dig in effectively, couldn't organize, couldn't do anything but hide and wait for the next shot. Around noon, Hayes' arm began to seriously degrade. The pain was constant now, and his fine motor control was suffering. He could still shoot, but the follow-up shots were slower, and he could feel his accuracy slipping. He had 14 rounds left. He needed water, needed rest, needed medical attention he wasn't going to get. But the enemy was breaking. He could see it in their movements, in the way they were abandoning fighting positions on the exposed southern side of the ridge and consolidating on a reverse slope, where Hayes couldn't reach them. They were still on the ridge, but they'd lost offensive capability. They were hiding, not fighting. That's when Hayes made his decision. If he could hurt them enough, inflict enough casualties, they might abandon position entirely before nightfall. He had to push them past their breaking point. He shifted to his third shooting position, the most exposed but with the best angle on the reverse slope, and began working through targets of opportunity. A soldier trying to set up a mortar, dead at 460 yards. 2 men dragging a wounded comrade. He let them go, but when a third man stood up to shout orders, dead at 420 yards. A machine gunner trying to reposition his weapon, dead at 405 yards. Hayes was methodical, cold, treating each shot as a mechanical problem to solve. He didn't think about the men he was killing, didn't process them as humans with families and lives. They were threats to be neutralized, variables in an equation where the only acceptable answer was survival. By 1400 hours, Hayes had fired his last round. 32 shots, 29 hits, and the North Korean position had collapsed. The enemy forces were streaming off the ridge in full retreat, abandoning equipment, abandoning wounded, just trying to get away from the invisible killer who turned their secure position into a death trap. Hayes watched them go, feeling the adrenaline drain out of him like water from a cracked cup. His arm was swollen and hot to the touch. His vision was starting to blur at the edges. He knew he was going into shock, that infection was setting in fast, and that he had maybe a few hours before he'd be unable to move at all. He forced himself to stand, to start moving south toward where he thought the American line should be. Every step was agony, his legs shaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He made it maybe 300 yards before he collapsed in a dry stream bed. He lay there, staring up at the sky, thinking that he'd done what he could, that the ridge was clear, that maybe it mattered. Then he passed out. Hayes woke up in a field hospital 18 hours later. A patrol from his regiment had found him in the stream bed, barely alive, delirious with fever. They'd also found the ridge, found the abandoned North Korean position, found the bodies. 19 confirmed enemy dead, plus an unknown number of wounded carried away during the retreat. The patrol sergeant, a veteran of World War II, had walked Hayes' shooting positions and done the math on the ranges involved. Nobody believed it at first. One rifleman, alone wounded, holding off and driving away a force that probably numbered 50 or more soldiers, with shots consistently landing at ranges beyond 400 yards. It shouldn't have been possible with a standard M1 Garand. When Hayes recovered enough to speak, they asked him how he'd done it. He told them about the modifications. He expected disciplinary action, expected to be reprimanded for unauthorized weapon alterations. Instead, the company commander, a captain named Dietrich, who'd been a competitive shooter before the war, asked to see the rifle. Hayes watched from his hospital cot as Dietrich field stripped the weapon, examined every modification Hayes had made: the shim barrel bedding, the stone trigger, the adjusted gas system, the modified sights. Dietrich didn't say anything for a long time. Then he looked at Hayes and said, "You build a sniper rifle out of a standard issue Garand, without a scope, without any gunsmithing tools worth mentioning, and you use it to hold a strategic position alone for 11 hours. That's either the stupidest thing I've ever heard or the most brilliant." The story spread fast through the regiment. Hayes became something of a legend, but an uncomfortable one. The modifications he'd made violated regulations. The action he'd taken, staying to fight instead of evading, violated tactical doctrine. He should have died on that ridge. And the fact that he hadn't was due to skills and initiative the Army didn't officially recognize or reward. But the results were undeniable. The ridge had been cleared without a counterattack, without American casualties beyond the original overrun. Intelligence later confirmed that the North Korean force had been the vanguard of a larger offensive operation, and their unexpected retreat and heavy losses had disrupted the enemy's timetable enough that the offensive was ultimately called off. Hayes spent 6 weeks recovering, his arm healing slowly, the infection finally broken by heavy doses of penicillin. When he returned to duty, his rifle was returned to him, still in its modified configuration. Unofficially, the company commander had made a decision that if a soldier had the skills to improve his weapon without compromising safety and had proven the modifications under combat conditions, the regulation against alterations could be quietly overlooked. Other soldiers in the company, those with gunsmithing or mechanical skills, began consulting with Hayes, asking about modifications. Hayes helped where he could, teaching the same principles his father had taught him. Understand the system, respect the tolerances, test obsessively, never compromise reliability. By the summer of 1951, at least a dozen riflemen in the regiment were shooting modified Garands, and their effectiveness in long-range engagements increased noticeably. The Army's official response was more complicated. At higher levels, Hayes' action was studied, analyzed, and quietly filed away. Some officers saw it as proof that individual initiative and technical skill mattered as much as doctrine. Others saw it as a dangerous precedent, a case of a soldier getting lucky after violating regulations, and worried about what would happen if less skilled men tried similar modifications and got themselves killed with unreliable weapons. No official commendation was issued. Hayes received no medal, no promotion, no recognition beyond the respect of the men who served with him. The riflemen who'd done the impossible, who'd turned a standard infantry weapon into a precision instrument through sheer skill, and then used it to hold off an enemy force single-handedly, remained a corporal, his name absent from official histories. Hayes survived the war. He rotated home in early 1952, returned to Kentucky, and went back to work in the machine shop. He didn't talk much about Korea, didn't tell the story of the ridgeline, except to a few close friends who'd been there. The rifle, his modified Garand, stayed with him. He kept it in a case in his workshop, and sometimes on weekends, he'd take it to the range and fire a few groups, just to remember that the modification still held, that the work he'd done still mattered. He married, had children, lived a quiet life building custom rifles for hunters and competitive shooters. His father's shop became his shop, and he passed on the same lessons he'd learned. That machinery could be understood, that tolerances could be exploited, that impossible was often just another word for difficult. The broader legacy of Hayes' stand took decades to fully materialize. In the years after Korea, the U.S. military began to recognize the importance of designated marksman roles, soldiers who could bridge the gap between standard riflemen and specialized snipers. The modified Garands that men like Hayes had created informally became a conceptual foundation for purpose-built marksman rifles. The M14, which replaced the M1 Garand in the late 1950s, incorporated some of the same principles Hayes had discovered through trial and error: better barrel bedding, improved triggers, enhanced sights. Later, the designated marksman rifle programs of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars owed their existence in part to the lessons learned from soldiers who'd refused to accept that their weapons couldn't be improved. Hayes died in 1997 at 73 from complications of lung cancer. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his service in Korea, but didn't detail his combat record. The rifle, his modified Garand, was inherited by his son, who understood its significance and donated it to the National Infantry Museum at Fort Benning. It sits there now in a climate control case, labeled with a small plaque that reads, M1 Garand rifle, field modified by Corporal Edwin Hayes, Korea 1951. Used in single-handed defense of Hill 428, March 14, 1951. 19 enemy casualties, 0 friendly losses. Visitors walk past it every day, most not understanding the story behind the worn metal and wood, not recognizing that what they're seeing isn't just a rifle, but a testament to the idea that ordinary men, when pushed to the edge of capability, can engineer solutions that change the outcome of battles. The ridgeline where Hayes made a stand is still there, unmarked, unnamed in official records, slowly being reclaimed by vegetation in a country that's moved on from the war fought across it. The exact spot where he lay for 11 hours, wounded and alone, firing shot after impossible shot, is indistinguishable from any other patch of Korean hillside. But the principal Hayes proved that individual skill and innovation matter, that regulations exist to serve survival rather than constrain it, that what seems impossible is often just untested. That principle echoes forward through every soldier who's ever looked at their issued equipment and thought, I can make this better. In the end, Hayes didn't revolutionize warfare. He didn't change doctrine from the top down. What he did was simpler and more profound. He refused to accept that his tools defined his limits, and in refusing, he saved his life and altered the course of the battle with nothing but skill, determination, and a rifle he'd rebuilt in secret, because he believed it could be done better. That's not the story of a hero in the traditional sense. It's the story of a craftsman who understood that survival sometimes requires building the tool nobody else knows you need, and then using it with precision that redefines what's possible. Where are you watching this story from? Comment below. If this story moved your heart even once, subscribe. It's the least tribute we can give to men like him,